Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt as we are reading through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are now in a little poem called Thought, which is poem number 20 of the 29 of By the Roadside. And of course we have to, kind of differentiate because we're going to have one poem in between this poem called Thought and another poem called Thought. And we've already seen that 8 times in Leaves of Grass the word thought or thoughts will be used in the title of a text. So this is kind of in and of itself fascinating that Whitman will just kind of throw the word thought as the topic. That is to say, observance, a kind of little musing. Now, our assumptions here are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, Talks with Walt, from the very beginning with inscriptions. In fact, we're going to begin with one of those early poems from inscriptions. We did give a set of introductory comments for By the Roadside, and we just finished with Mother and Babe. Now, I want to remind you, since we are here, that we have said a number of times that we are looking at the 5 P's of Whitman, one of those being the political Whitman. But one of the elements of political Whitman is his iconoclasm. That is to say, like Chaucer and like any number of other great writers, Whitman falls in line behind those thinkers that want to challenge political thought and political obedience and political uniformity, and his iconoclasm is going to be profound. Now, our Norton's study will tell us that this was number 7 of the thoughts in Leaves of Grass 1860, and it was reprinted in 1867 in the same position. It took the title Thought in Leaves of Grass 1871 and 1876 ungrouped, and was placed in By the Roadside in 1881. Now, before I read this poem, I just want to remind you, so that we're not surprised by what we're about to read, that Whitman will write at the very beginning of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass a little poem to the states, which of course we've already exegeted. And it runs like this: to the states, or any one of them, or any city of the states, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. Now, of course, a passage like that, as we said in our lecture, goes rather nicely with some of the thinkers of Whitman's day. Obviously, we think of Thoreau and civil disobedience. Let's now turn to this poem and to try to feel our way to exactly what is going on. Of obedience, faith, adhesiveness. As I stand aloof and look, there is to me something profoundly affecting in large masses of men following the lead of those who do not believe in men. Now, of course, the word obedience takes us back to the poem To the States. The word faith is also used in one of those early poems in the inscriptions passage in Cabin Ships at Sea. And of course, adhesiveness is a very popular word that Whitman will have picked up from some of the phenomenology of his own day and psychology, that was beginning to grow there. But we saw this word, you'll remember, in Song of the Open Road passage 6. Of will immediately take us to the opening line of Milton's Paradise Lost. I have said to you guys, I think Milton stands behind a lot of the iconoclasm of Whitman, and I've tried to point this out in other lectures, in other poems, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree that brought death into the world and all our woe. The use of the word of in this way, of obedience, faith, adhesiveness. Now, here's the thing. None of those in and of themselves for Whitman are necessarily bad. However, they have a tendency to kind of lead towards a certain kind of groupthink that Whitman will obviously have some serious problems with, especially after he has given some time to Emerson's essays, especially like Self-Reliance, of which we've already given a number of comments on at learnstrong.net. And then he says it, as I stand aloof, and that's fascinating, and that takes us back to a poem, of course, in By the Roadside, I Sit and Look Out, where you'll remember the last word of that poem is silent. I look at all the pain of the world, and I'm kind of distant, I'm kind of silent, aloof here. I sit and look out. The word aloof will get used in Song of Prudence later here. I stand aloof and look, and we're back to this thing of I see from Mother and Babe, the poem right before it. There is to me something profoundly affecting, and that word is probably best understood as disturbing. In large masses, you'll remember in starting from Paumanok passage 2, the whole idea of countless masses. Whitman is always concerned with masses. Concerned, obviously he'll celebrate the idea of unity, but he's concerned here of masses of men following the lead of those who do not believe in men. Now obviously we're getting ourselves ready for the last poem of the Roadside Collection to the States to identify the 16th, 17th, or 18th president. What is he actually saying though here? I think this is one of those little genius poems in Leaves and Grass. He says, I'm fascinated the way certain kinds of political leaders can manipulate such precious ideas as obedience, faith, and adhesiveness. And the reason is because while these politicians can speak, they don't actually believe in the very heart of men and of women, of humanity, of the potentiality. That is to say, Whitman's going to make a powerful distinction, which will obviously take us to Plato and to the Republic, and of course the Thrasymachos question of Republic 1. I've given full lectures on that elsewhere at learnstrong.net. Let's now turn to some messaging here. 2a, I think he's making the argument that people can easily be manipulated by politicians they believe in, and precious ideas can be manipulated and for something terrible that just, I mean, obedience is a great thing, but it kind of obviously it can be terribly manipulative in its own way. I like the idea 2b of pointing out the way Whitman uses the word of, and we've pointed out how he loves to play around with prepositions. I think here this idea of is borrowed from Milton's Paradise Lost, which obviously leads us to 3a, and Milton and Paradise Lost, the great iconoclastic thinker. We've given full lectures on all of Paradise Lost at learnstrong.net. You can go and run that to ground if you're so inclined. I also want to point out that I think Milton is playing around with that Thrasymachos question of Republic 1. You'll remember that Thrasymachos says, look, leaders, when in that discussion with Socrates and Glaucon later, leaders, they're like herders of sheep, right? Shepherds. Shepherds don't take care of sheep because they love sheep. Thrasymachos says, shepherds take care of sheep because they like lamb chops. That is to say, that's what leaders are all about. Of course, the Republic is an intended essay on how, a dialogue on how specifically that is a corrupt view of leadership. But you'll remember that the Thrasymachos question will get played then out again by Machiavelli in The Prince. He who builds on the people builds on mud is the way that he says it, and yet the great leaders for him are the ones that have that ability to manipulate and to take ideas like obedience and faith and adhesiveness and use them in some way to further the agenda of the prince and maybe by extension the state. Finally, I would ask you at 3b, do you believe in politicians who don't believe in men? Or to what degree have you witnessed this kind of thing as Whitman is playing the game happening? And how can you know if a politician is in fact authentic? Because it will often appear that politicians very much believe in obedience and faith and adhesiveness and are using those ideas for positive ways, but how can you actually know that? This is obviously going to be a central question in the life of Whitman, especially, of course, because of his great love of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.